You are listening to Quality Time, a podcast designed to support Nebraskan providers through their journey with Step Up to Quality. I am your host, Colleen Schmidt. Get ready to listen as we prepare to elevate each other as we step up to quality. Welcome back, listeners. Welcome back, everyone. Today on our podcast, we have the pleasure of learning from J.R. Girón. J.R. is the Grassroots and Advocacy Advisor for First Five Nebraska. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with First Five Nebraska, their mission is to spark public conversations about early childhood to give more Nebraskan children a great start and prosperous future. I love that. They work with elected officials, business and industry leaders, educators, and community stakeholders to advance early childhood policies and solutions. We are so happy to have you, JR, as a guest to help us kind of unpack advocacy today. I think you are the perfect person to have to interview for this topic. But before we get going, share with our listeners a little bit about your story, like what led you to do the work you're doing now.
Sure. Yes. Well, I'm glad to talk to you. This is fun. It's nice to meet you. So I kind of joke around sometimes that I did not choose advocacy. Advocacy chose me. I wanted to be a teacher. I was on track to be a teacher and came home after my freshman year of college to take care of my grandparents who had raised me since I was a little person. And in doing so, I was, they lived in a neighborhood. I grew up in a neighborhood that was sort of removed from opportunity. That was sort of shut off. It was very disadvantaged in certain ways in terms of access to food. The socioeconomic status was not high. We didn't have a lot of social mobility. And so as I was there and I was taking care of grandma and grandpa, I had a chance to talk with other parents and families that I'd kind of known my whole life, but now I was re-entering the conversation as a young adult and was put on alert that there was this trend in our neighborhood with the young people. And because of where we were and the opportunities in and out of our situations, there was a high level of gang recruitment, right? And I think sometimes people forget that if kids don't have good choices, they can't make good choices. And so these were young people I'd known, I'd babysat, some of them were cousins. And when the families would talk to me about it, and what we would hear is that from the top down, there would be these programs coming in where people thought that they knew why our neighborhood kids were going into gangs. They knew what the solution was. And every now and then they talked to a parent or two. But really, it was an opportunity to raise attention to the people that were making decisions, but maybe not the ones that wanted to come up with solutions, and bring the community along to help design those solutions, but then also to participate in making the good thing happen. So it was entirely accidental. It worked just because I was kind of standing in between a couple different spaces, and I was young and excited and didn't have any intention for that to become something I continued to do. But as life went on, and sort of my path just kept connecting one stepping stone to another, I ended up working in that field for a really long time as an informal advocate for years. And then that kind of bled into working with the unhoused population. I grew up in Denver. And then after moving, I was working for years with prisoner reentry. So basically working with men that were coming out of the prison system and giving them life skills. And then also that was where the policy advocacy started for me, was working on those pieces of policy that put those men at a higher risk for recidivism, right? Not being able to get a job, not being able to find a place to live. And so the advocacy, that put me in contact for the first time with working closely with lobbyists. And again, my intention was never to become a policy advocate, but to make sure that those guys were the ones adding the information and the solutions and the ideas, and also being able to give firsthand stories on the challenges. And so that just continued to, build upon itself until I found myself thinking like, wow, I really love this work. It isn't an essence teaching, right? It's about giving communities tools to understand, giving these disenfranchised and those furthest from opportunity a chance to understand, and then everybody coming together, but making sure that those solutions are informed by the communities that impact them. that was what led me to First Five. Was I realized I had always been on the other side of the issue. I had always been working in a reactive stance with communities that were already being harmed, already feeling the impact of different social policies. And one of the things that had stood out to me, both in working with the young people in gang diversion, with the guys coming out of the incarceration system, and then I worked a lot with teen moms and refugee families. But in three of those big situations, one of the things that always stood out to me, and it's anecdotal totally, and Dr. Darrow with Buffett and Dr. Best with First Five would both be appalled that I'm quoting this. But one of the things that always stood out to me was that in almost every instance, as I got to know these people and heard their stories, which is such an important part of advocacy, as I'm sure we'll talk about, all of them felt their windows of opportunity start to close before they were 8 years old.
Oh.
All of them had some story, right? That would be like, and maybe not even consciously, they couldn't say, hey, by the time I was in third grade, but as they'd sort of walk me through their journeys and kind of those highlights or those crisis moments or those defining moments, for all of them, it happened between their conscious memory unfolding and by the time they were 7, 8 years old. So getting on board with the early childhood and education train became very exciting to me because there's definitely a proactive and preventative amount of work in that, not just for kids, but for the communities that those kids live in.
Absolutely. Your story gives me goosebumps. I don't think it was an accident. I think that sounds a lot like destiny or your calling or following the breadcrumbs. I feel like that was not accidental, that you decided to change how you're going to serve kids and families through the lens of advocacy instead of being a classroom teacher. I also really, your story is amazing, first of all, and the work that you've done on the other end of things is extensive. I'm curious if you have done any work with the Heart Ministry here in Omaha, or are familiar with them. It sounds similar to what you might have been doing. Were you in Denver when you were working with those men who were recently out of being incarcerated and trying to get back in the system?
Yeah, actually, for that work, it's kind of funny. I had a 4-year stint or 3-year stint in Michigan. And so my husband then was studying at the U of M. So I was working in between Detroit and Ann Arbor with guys that were largely from Detroit and coming out of the prison system there in Michigan before I moved here to Lincoln, 8 years ago.
Wow, that's cool work. In fact, when I was a student teacher, my cooperating teacher was amazing. But since she has retired, she has done a lot of her serving and work at the Heart Ministry, working with exactly who you're talking about. And she loves it. It's powerful work. So I do often see how we as educators or providers or caregivers or whatever verbiage we want to use, I can see how advocacy totally fits in to almost that job description or that call or that desire to help. So your story's neat, JR. I love this. You already touched a little bit about it when you were talking about now you get to work on the proactive side of things, right? Instead of the reactive after we're adults and all these things have happened to us in life. So let's dive in and talk a little bit more about early childhood specifically. Why is early childhood important, and why do we want to be proactive with helping and serving young children and their families?
I love this question. I wish more people would ask this question that way because it sets up conversations. I think one of the biggest challenges when we talk about early childhood is that people think specifically of a certain age and a certain approach. It's very limited, right? They think of it in this very siloed, minimal way, as opposed to the big picture of the whole community. And so obviously at the micro level, early childhood matters because just the brain science is so important from birth to, we tend to think of education as starting in kindergarten, but my goodness, it starts the minute those babies draw breath. And I have 2 grandbabies. My youngest, he's just now 2 months old. And even just watching his little skills and his attention and his just even the way his eyes move and what catches attention at 8 weeks old is phenomenal, right? When you really think about it. So from the micro perspective and that the brain science and the development of that healthy cognitive ability and how it impacts their physical health. So those are obviously really important. And then as you expand on that, the way it prepares them for a more formal learning environment, it sets them up for school success. One of the things that I hear from providers and teachers right now is how, because of things like COVID or isolation, children don't have the same self-regulating skills. They're social emotional, right? Have you been hearing that too? It's pretty wild.
I've been witnessing it.
Yes.
I would totally, and I know every learner or every listener who's tuning in is like shaking their head like,
Oh yeah. And I'm never going to say it was a good thing that happened, but the silver lining coming out of it is that not only do we have scientific evidence of that, but also then you've got all of these anecdotal stories from parents, from teachers, from anyone who interacts with children of any age, right? But we saw it specifically in those toddlers and infants, because that's when those bonds were just developing and the concepts of those emotional, social were developing. And obviously for me, that ties back into their ability to self-regulate, their ability to make good choices so that they have a bigger emotional and social toolbox when they find themselves in situations where sometimes the easiest and best option that appears to them at the moment isn't the best for them long term. So that was a big one that I always think about in terms of its big value to community. But then add to that when parents have kids that are growing in a healthy and developed way, when they can trust that their children are safe, when parents have the chance to do work that they enjoy or that fulfills them, or, just something that they feel is important because it puts food on the table and it keeps families connected and invested in the community. My goodness, that just has a ripple effect, right? Like, parents need to know their kids are safe. Those kids need to be developing well and being stimulated and loved on. And it's the whole village. It takes a village to raise itself, but it also takes a village to care for itself and to heal itself.
Yep.
And so early childhood kind of is I think we think of it as this tangential thing that only impacts people that have toddlers and infants, but it's such a crucial piece of the entire backbone of a culture.
I like how you're phrasing it as early childhood is the backbone of our culture. Yes. Everything you just said, you are preaching to the choir. Mm-hmm. Like, everyone listening is just like, we know, like the early childhood people, we feel what you said so deeply. We know this. But what is sometimes a roadblock is, okay, if we know this to be true, either through our own experiences, from having young children of our own, serving young children, and or from the research behind why, paying attention and putting supports toward early childhood really help to build up your community and serve your entire community, like it's a big deal. The roadblock we often find is, what do we do about it? How do we start kind of advocating for that? And that's a big part of what we've been talking about all season. Our theme is advocacy, but what we're really trying to kind of dive into is figuring out, okay, if we know these things to be true and we believe everything JR just said, yes, listeners are like, yes, JR, keep going. What I want to kind of pick your brain about is, how do we do this in tangible ways? You have a really amazing blog post that you wrote, and the title is Everyday Advocacy: How Small Moments Can Yield Big Results for Kids and Families in Your Communities. You're a really good writer. I love the blog. I thought it was really succinct. But can you share a little bit with our listeners? What are some examples of how we can advocate to Nebraskan stakeholders? Because that feels intimidating. When I hear that, I'm like, I don't know. What are some steps we can take to help advocate for early childhood?
Oh, absolutely. No, and I think it's important too. I think you hit it on the head that sometimes there's some fear and trepidation because maybe our maybe our concept of what that looks like is really intimidating, or maybe it's simply that we don't even know where to begin, right?
Yes. Yep.
And so I think a good place to start is even redefining who we call stakeholders. Very often when people talk about advocacy, what I hear them talking about is going straight to a state senator, going straight to a federal delegate. And while there's value in that, honestly, the most bang for your buck in the beginning is going to be identifying those people that have stake in your community specifically, right? Starting there. And if a stakeholder might be the owner of the grocery store that you go to, it might be a faith leader that has a big group of families. It might be actually one of the parents that you work with because their child is in your center or your home center and they happen to be a business person, or they sit on the chamber, or, these are all people who are stakeholders. And so if we start to reframe it as who in your community is impacted by access to quality early childhood education, then the list gets really long.
Yeah.
Right? You really have to sit with it for a minute or two to think about, like, wow, who is impacted by the availability of this and the fact that these kiddos are going to come out loved and nurtured and ready to learn more. Then it's easier to frame how you can talk to them, because it's going to be a more personable conversation. It's going to be tied to the personal impact on them or on their business or on their community or neighborhood. And at the end of the day, if you did, for those that did get to read the blog, advocacy is really purposeful storytelling. It's really about figuring out how to tell the story in a way that it's not just here's what's wrong, or here's what's broken, or here's what we need, but it's that compelling story of when these things are in place, our community can look like X, right? Here's what we have to offer. If we can keep this in place, here's how it will flow into our community in really meaningful and beautiful ways. And then, of course, that does set you up once people want to know more to talk about, like, that's why we have these gaps in the system we need to address, right? Whether it's infrastructure for childcare or accessible spots or teacher pay, good gracious, like there's some big ones, right? But if you can begin to shift your concept of stakeholder, then advocacy doesn't start to feel as intimidating. And it's also a really good place to start to create that story. How can you tell it succinctly? How can you tell it in a compelling and powerful way? And one of the things I like to coach advocates on is to lead with what is possible and not with what is wrong.
Ooh.
Right? Well, don't we all have something that we can be like, here's my hand, somebody call on me. Let me tell you all the things that are wrong with our industry, our community, our society, our culture. And now with social media being so prevalent, there's a lot of places for people to just complain.
Yeah.
And we need those safe spaces, right? I make it very clear to the people I work with, like, girl, if you are burnt out, my friend, if you cannot hang on another day and you just need to be angry. And it can be you and I, it can be you and other teammates you have. And then we got to go back out and remind the community of what is possible and what would a win look like? What does success in a community look like if these needs are being met? Once you've established that trust and that pace, then you can start to talk about the things you need in order to make that happen.
Wow, you just made me have an entire paradigm shift. Here's why. I've done trainings. We did a big one in Nebraska just this last year that it was like a multi-series training where we gathered a bunch of early childhood educators and providers in the evening after working, holding the babies all day. They showed up for this training on advocacy. And the goal was to support them with strategies they can use, but to also create and write an elevator speech. And when I think about my elevator speech that I have concocted over the years for various different purposes, my speech does not lead with what is possible. And you made me have like a total like, ooh, that's exactly maybe how we start moving the needle, is by focusing on, yes, there are issues and we have concerns and there are there's major work to do. but what does success look like in our community? What's the overall like goal with that? So can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm throwing you a curveball. I just want to hear you talk more because you made me have this total like, ooh, I need to reflect on my own little elevator speech I have because I don't think I do what you just said.
Yes. Well, and some of it too is the social perception of advocacy. And especially right now, right, where I think all of us could run around with our hands up saying the world is on fire, and that wouldn't necessarily be incorrect, right? We see struggles with education, with economic stability, with mental health. Like we all know that that there are very critical issues that need to be addressed in the community. But let me give you a perfect example of this too, because it's also one I think everyone has a context for. The famous speech that Dr. King made when he started began with, I have a dream.
Yeah.
Right? That's what he led with. That was whenever anybody thinks of Dr. King, and he did so many things. He was an advocate and an activist, and an educator, obviously, but he led with, I have a dream. And then he painted the picture of this world, right? Where everyone was connected and equal and free and liberated. And then he drew attention to like, so this is what needs to change in order for us all to be there. Now, I know that might feel lofty. One, the man was a brilliant orator. And two, he had already helped to build this huge movement. I also like to remind people that the movement was not led by Dr. King. Dr. King joined the movement and then became one of the leaders in the face of the movement.
Right.
It was actually started by a teacher. The counter sit-ins that everybody knows and talks about were actually started by a high school teacher named Miss Looper, and she was in Oklahoma City. And so the counter sit-ins then became the thing that started everywhere. Sorry, that was my rabbit trail. I just love to tell teachers that story.
I didn't know that fun fact. And I'm going to Google that as soon as we're done recording here because I didn't know that.
Yep. Yep. Miss Looper, Luper, she was a high school teacher. And so she did it there in Oklahoma City, which was, I think we only think of the Jim Crow effect is only happening in the South, but racism is a systemic issue, so it was happening everywhere in some context. But given all of that and the magnitude, and talk about this sense of urgency and the critical need for those issues to be addressed, and Dr. King still led with, I have a dream. And so even to use that concept when we're talking about it and to shift our version of advocacy and activism towards that kind of vision casting, picture painting, right? You got to draw a picture of what people can be, because it's hard to imagine what isn't there.
Right.
It's just hard to even imagine what you're building if you don't have a blueprint or a painting or something. And right now there's this, and it's kind of, I'm not going to say it's right now because historically this has always been the case. When we talk about advocacy and activism, the stuff that's real sexy, that gets all the press, are those angry in the streets demanding change people.
Yep.
And I will not going to come out and say that there's not a time and a place for activism and for kind of that, like, no, we demand change right now. But good gravy, when somebody comes up to you and demands something, right? It's not compelling, A. And B, it's very often situational. But if you want to change the system and not an event or an outcome, if you want to change the system, that's all about storytelling. That is all about winning people to that dream and winning people to that vision and being willing to play the long game, because systemic change does not happen based on one event and one story. Absolutely. So how do you continue to tell that story to those people, and starting with those stakeholders redefined in your community, so that you start to build that wave, right? So that more and more people start to have that collective imagination around what is good and beautiful and true. And then they can start to see, as you help them fill in the gaps, because you're an expert on early childhood education, then they can start to be like, oh gosh, we need to address X, Y, and Z. And then also you have the collective imagination built in such a way that you can be more proactive, you can be more intentional and come at it with a sense of urgency once that story's been told.
I am so happy we had you on this podcast.
Well, I mean, I'm happy too, but
I am like this, what you're saying right now. I fully agree and fully believe that to be true. And what you're talking about with having purposeful storytelling as a form of advocacy, we've had that echoed a few times this season, mainly through one of our favorite returning champs, which is Ray Pica, who has written, I think, over, I don't even want to quote the number of books, but maybe 30 plus at least. Like she's an early childhood expert. But that's something that she really dives into in her most recent book on advocacy and early childhood education is tell your story. And I really love, JR, how you reframe the idea of stakeholders and who are the stakeholders in our community and how do we have this vision of what could be possible and then joining together with telling our stories, using research to fill in that gaps, like everything you said, beautiful. I love all of the messages you've shared with us today. Do you have, I think we could, like, I don't want to go down too many bird walks, JR, because we'll be on here for literally another hour and a half.
I feel like you and I could end up chatting about this for quite some time.
But I want to know, do you have any final points or thoughts that you want our listeners to take home? What can you share about advocacy and early childhood education? Any final thoughts?
Yes, I think there's just maybe 2 or 3 quick things to say. One, I want to encourage every single early childhood educator to reframe their own identity in the community as an educator, a business person, and a community leader, because you are literally forming the citizens of tomorrow, right? You are all 3 of those things. And so it's hard enough when childcare providers and educators are fighting against the babysitter stigma or the daycare stigma, which again just leads to changing the story in the community, right? So advocate for yourself in your own mind. Make sure that your own identity and context is that you are all of these things and you are a crucial part of the economic and social backbone of your community. And then at the state level, obviously, and then, that one just keeps going up to the macro level. I think the other thing to remember is that your story is crucial to changing the system, but it cannot be only your story.
Yeah.
That is so important, right? Your voice matters. Oh my goodness, your voice is so important. And I would hope that in every instance, an early childhood educator would feel ready, prepared, and confident to share their story. But where it changes policy is when that story brings along more stories, more evidence, and more of the community voice and investment to create a collective narrative and a community-wide narrative. And so how do you use your story? How do you tell it? How do you maintain and keep it as your own? And then how do you bring other stories along with you to be able to tell the community story? And I think that one gets hard because then we start to feel like, oh, well, it's not about my story anymore. Yes, it is. Oh my goodness, yes, it is. Because we are many, right? We are a stained glass window of stories, but you need the whole window and not just one pane. And so that's the powerful part of that, is just figure out how to do that and not lose sight, though, of the collective narrative. And I think the last one is just to trust that the community wants to be its best version of itself. And that it is hard to feel like you are doing this day in and day out. And maybe it's not clicking. Why does it still feel so uphill? Maybe you feel alone. I hear that often from providers and it breaks my heart because, gosh, I would never want that for any of them. But also, like, no, there's 2,000 of you in the state of Nebraska and more, right? Because we're only talking about licensed childcare providers and there's so many other people providing quality care. But goodness, no, just know that the road is long, but you are not walking it by yourself. And it's the persistence. And I realize this may come across as cheesy, but that notion of joy as an act of resistance. So we persist in joy as an act of resistance, and resistance only to the dark side of it, to the sense of hopelessness and despair, or that you can't make a difference. And just back to the beginning story I was telling you, just knowing even that all of those amazing people I worked with that were either at risk for being incarcerated or had been, my goodness, I just think of so many of the providers I know and how that's not going to change the world. And it certainly wouldn't have necessarily changed everything about those young people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
But my goodness, what a difference it would have made for them and their families.
Mm-hmm.
And so just continue to persist with joy as an act of resistance. That in and itself is advocacy too.
Wow. Oh, JR, thank you for joining our podcast this season. I am so grateful for you and for what you just shared with our listeners. Listeners, I was like scribbling down notes as JR's talking because I'm just unpacking a lot of things in my own mind. So I'm sure you all are too, being the backbone of advocacy and of the community. Like our providers and our educators are the backbone. I hope you heard that message. I loved your last little quote you shared, JR, about persistent joy as an act of resistance. I need to remember that. I feel like I need to put that on a sticky note and look at that every day.
Me too, if it makes me too.
But thank you for joining us. And thank you for our yes. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, likewise. And thanks for the invite. No, I had a great time talking with you.
Oh, and thank you, listeners. Thanks again for spending quality time with us. Please join next time as we chat about future topics to support our Nebraskan providers on their journeys with Step Up to Quality. Until next time, bye-bye.